Number 1. Delivery. I have been delivering food for a Chinese restaurant for a few years. I was in college at the time. What I always remembered most about the job was the differences I had with other students who did not work delivery when it came to snow days. When there was a snowstorm on the way, and a possible day off from classes, almost everyone would get excited. I, on the other hand, would not, because whenever there was a snowstorm, or some strong wintry weather of any kind, people ordered delivery food a lot more often. So it meant that not only would I be working, but I'd be working in some pretty nasty conditions. This was during my sophomore year in college. I won't mention what college I went to, but it was in an area that got very cold and very snowy winters. And the storm that was supposed to be coming that day was a doozy. Several feet of snow would accumulate, and it was supposed to get very, very cold. Sure enough, in the morning, all classes had been canceled. And when I looked out the window, it was pretty bad already. Part of me hoped that the restaurant would be closed, but I knew there was no chance of that happening. This was the sort of day when business at the restaurant would be booming. When I got to work at noon, it was still snowing then, and I knew it would be throughout the day, so I knew this wasn't going to be fun. The majority of my deliveries were to college kids. Well, that made sense. They were our biggest customers, being in a college town. But we also had some deliveries in the town and the outlying areas. Normally, those were the ones that I preferred, because they tended to tip bigger. Although on snow days, even the college kids would give bigger tips. As the day went on, I kept fighting myself to get through it all, but it was tough. One of the last deliveries I had was right around the time we closed. My boss told me it was the last delivery order, and I should just go home after I made it. It was to an apartment building in the town. I was relieved after a very busy and stressful day of work. My car was still covered in snow because no matter how much of it I brushed off, it kept coming back. I got to the apartment building. This was the absolute last delivery, so I was looking forward to getting it done so I could go home later. I buzzed the apartment number. No one said anything through the intercom. They simply buzzed me in. This wasn't something that happened very often, but I didn't mind. I got in and I took the stairs up to the 4th floor, which was the highest floor in the building. Then I walked down the hallway. It was a dark hallway, but I'd been in the building before, so I wasn't surprised at that. When I got to the door, I knocked on it. No one answered at first, so I knocked a few more times. Finally, the door opened a little bit. Someone was peeking out the door at me. I announced who I was, and he opened the door a bit more. "I have your order," I told him. He looked me over and put out his hand. I handed him the food and expected him to hand me money back. Instead, he pulled the bag out of my hand and slammed the door in my face. I could hear him locking and chaining the door. Well, I was pissed, and I began banging on the door. I was telling the guy that he had to pay for the food. I kept knocking and there was no response, so I began pounding harder on the door. When the guy kept ignoring me, I finally yelled that if he didn't come to the door, I would have to call the cops. A few moments later, I heard the door being unchained and unlocked. This time, the man opened the door quickly and shoved a knife at me. "Call the cops on me and I'll fucking gut you," the guy yelled at me. I fell back, now scared, but he stepped forward again, slashing back and forth with his knife. I ran down the hall, and when I looked back, I saw him closing the door. Well, I hate to call anyone stupid, but he was stupid if he thought I wasn't calling the police after that. And I did. They came there and they arrested the guy, but only after they threatened to break in the door because he didn't answer it over and over when they knocked. I don't understand some people. I don't know how they think they can do things like that and actually get away with it. Number 2. Subway. This happened to me back in the early 1980s, and it really didn't happen to me as much as I was only a casual witness to it, but it was a frightening event. It was a few days before Christmas, and I was homeless at the time. I know a lot of people don't believe in climate change, but one way or another, it was a lot colder back then than it is right now. And being homeless, that just made it worse. I hadn't been able to sleep for a while. I'd been panhandling, trying to get anything I could to get some food, and maybe a means to find someplace warm where I could get some rest. My hands were freezing, but I was finally able to get enough money to get into a McDonald's and order myself something to eat and get some coffee. I couldn't spend a lot of time in the McDonald's though. They had a rule that was meant to discourage homeless people. You could only be inside the store for 30 minutes before they would ask you to leave. Well, I didn't have enough money to get into a squatting house, and yeah, they generally required you to give them a few bucks to get in, but I did have enough to ride on the subway, so I figured I'd get on there, and I would ride it and try to get some sleep. Although the subways were not very warm, they were definitely better than being outside and freezing your butt off. If you've never been homeless before, you'll find that being homeless makes it easier for you to fall asleep in uncomfortable places, and I fell asleep pretty easily on the subway. I was occasionally rattled by the noise of the preachers walking down the cars, and that happened a lot back then. They would walk up and down the cars and preach the gospel. It really wasn't enough to wake me up, though. It had been early in the afternoon when I was sleeping, and I was awoken by the unmistakable sound of gunshots. I jumped up, and the shots came from a different car, but I could tell that they were not far off. I saw people in the car next to mine running up against the wall of the car that was close to the connection. People in my car were panicked. Some were trying to get closer to the car, others as far away as possible. I was a little disorientated, so I didn't know what to do at first, but there was a lot of screaming and panic on the car. Since I figured it was the car behind me that the bullets were shot, I got up and ran to the far side of the car. And when I did, it wasn't long until we got to the next stop. Plenty of panicked people got off the cars and were running fast to get out of the station. I was one of them. It turns out that the man claimed he was being robbed, and he shot the robbers on the subway. It actually became a really well-known story at the time. Now, many decades later, when I tell this story, most people don't make the connection right away. But fortunately, I'm not homeless, and I haven't been for a long time. That incident was one of the things that helped scare me off the streets. Within months, I had a job and a place to live. I guess when hearing the facts of what happened, I wasn't in any danger of being shot. The man who did the shooting only shot at the people because he claimed they were trying to rob him. He didn't try to hurt anybody else, but that didn't make it any less scary at the time. Number 3. Roommate. This happened to me before the internet was really the big thing that it is nowadays. Nowadays, if you're looking to rent an apartment or find a roommate, you can do that through Craigslist or an apartment renting site. It's easier to get a lot more information about who you might be moving in with before you decide to go meet them. It wasn't like that back then. You would find an ad in a newspaper, or you would see a bulletin board in a grocery store or laundromat, and you call someone, probably talk just a little bit, and then set up an appointment. Although I haven't had to find a new place to live in a very long time, I can tell you that I do really prefer the way things are nowadays. This is mainly because of the first time that I had ever moved out. This happened in the winter of 1995. I'd been out of high school for about a year at that time. I didn't want to go to college. I remained at home, and I worked in a grocery store for about a year after I graduated. It wasn't ideal living at home. In fact, it created a lot of friction with my parents, and it just began to get worse and worse a few weeks after Christmas. So I decided that it would be best for everyone if I just moved out. We lived in the suburbs, but I wanted to live in the city, so I began trying to find roommates that way. And many times I would call up someone, make an appointment to see their place, and I would end up going, interviewing from them, and then I would never hear from them again. I guess it was because of how young I was. I was only 19 at the time, and most people thought that having a 19-year-old roommate automatically meant they also had an immature or irresponsible roommate. That's when I got an appointment with someone named Tim. He lived in the city and was a student going for a degree in acting. And just as a side note, I never really understood why anyone went for a degree in acting. Other than being an acting teacher, I never thought you could do much with a degree. But anyway, he was a few years older than me. I'll never forget the day walking there. It was winter time, and we could only meet after he was done with his classes. So it was dark while I rode the train to the city. I can still remember looking out the green window of the train at the snow falling. It had been a really snowy winter, and I was going to not have fun trudging through it. I was freezing as I walked from the train station to his house. I was also getting a bit wet from the snow falling, but I simply hoped that this would be fine. When I met Tim, I had to admit that I did find him a bit attractive. I mean, he must have felt the same way about me too, because he was obviously flirting with me. And I'm sorry to say that the interview for the apartment turned into a hookup, and I spent the night over there as well. Although the hookup was fun, I didn't think that it would bode well for my chances of getting the apartment, so I kept looking the next few days. I was surprised eventually, however, when I ended up getting the apartment. Things were okay living with him at first, but it didn't take long until I figured out exactly why he wanted me as a roommate. He enjoyed the hookup on the first night, and he thought by us living together, he had an automatic hookup whenever he wanted it. Unfortunately, I didn't really share that idea. Looking back on this as an adult, I can see that I was stupid to sleep with him the first time. It just gave him the impression that it was something that I was willing to continue to go along with. And the appeal for it didn't last very long for me. However, I still fooled around with him a bit here and there, almost as if I felt like I was required to do so. His behavior got erratic as well. Although he would hook up with others occasionally, if I went on a date with anyone, he would get pissy about it, and everything just got worse when he began to get really moody. I began spending more time in my bedroom with the door closed than I'd ever planned on doing. And as a 19-year-old, I definitely did not know that isolating myself was just making the situation worse. And it did get worse. He would get angry at me if I left a glass sitting on the counter or the sink. Keep in mind, he did plenty of that himself, but it was only when I did it that it became a terrible thing. It didn't take very long until the situation got worse and more uncomfortable, and I decided the best thing for me to do was move out. Now, here's where things get a little iffy. I had several friends who told me that he was unbalanced, that I should move one day while he was at school. And maybe I should have. But I was too nervous to do that, and I made the mistake of leaving him a note, telling him I was going to move out. He got the note while I was sleeping, and I was awakened that night by him pounding on my locked door. He was yelling and screaming, demanding to be let into the room. I pretended to still be asleep, but it didn't stop him. He ended up eventually breaking down the door and barging into the room. He grabbed me on the bed and began strangling me, and the look that was on his face was pure malice and hatred. I had never seen anything like it before. I was initially too shocked to do anything to defend myself, but it was obvious to me after a few moments that he was not going to let up on the strangling, so I tried to pull his hands off my throat. However, he proved either strong enough or angry enough to continue to choke me. I did the only thing I could think of. I took my foot and brought it right up into his balls as hard as I could. He let go immediately and crumpled to the floor. I grabbed my coat and my keys, and I ran out of the apartment and out the door. I walked through the cold and snow over to a friend's house, and I spent the night there. My plan was to go back the next day and get my things out of the apartment while he was at school. However, he decided not to go to school that day. So I had to call the police, and they supervised me getting all of my stuff out of there. For weeks, I knew that Tim was calling my friends, trying to find out where I'd gone. He told them to tell me that I'd better hope he never finds me. But he never did. I never saw him again. Well, that's not true, actually. He does have an IMDb page, but there's not much to it. But I want to make it clear that I know I was largely at fault for what happened. I handled it poorly, but I don't think an attempted murder was the right response on his part. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.